In the early afternoon of September 18, 96 CE, the Roman Empire lost its absolute ruler to a concealed blade. Emperor Domitian was in his office when a servant, faking an arm injury to hide a dagger, overpowered him and delivered the fatal blow. This single act of violence pushed Rome to the edge of civil war. The Senate had despised Domitian's tyranny, but the military remained loyal to his memory, leaving the state divided between two factions with opposing loyalties. The Senate knew they had a rapidly closing window. If they didn't immediately install a leader acceptable to both sides, the army or the Praetorian Guard would step in and take the city by force. To prevent the empire from burning, they made a desperate choice. They handed the highest office in the known world to the oldest, frailest, and least physically intimidating man in their inner circle. That man was Marcus Cocceius Nerva. At 66, he looked nothing like a hardened conqueror, with his sloping forehead, hooked nose, and thin neck. He was constantly battling illness, often to the point where he couldn't keep his food down. Instead of a battle-tested general, Nerva was a lifelong senatorial diplomat and an accomplished poet. It raised an immediate question: how exactly does an aging intellectual maintain control over a massive military apparatus that responds almost exclusively to strength and bloodshed? His rise to power was an experiment. The Senate was betting that negotiation, prestige, and financial generosity could stabilize a state without the need for an autocratic iron fist. Right away, Nerva tried to win over the public. He granted amnesty to the exiled, halted the vicious treason trials, and returned unjustly seized property. He also rolled out a welfare program called the Alimenta. The state provided low-interest loans to Italian landowners to improve their farms. The 5% interest they paid went directly to their local municipalities to feed and educate poor children. He tackled religious tensions, easing the malicious enforcement practices surrounding the collection of the Jewish tax. To ensure the provinces knew a fairer administration was in charge, he minted coins like this one to broadcast his legitimacy. This bronze coin, displaying clasped hands over an army standard, was issued during Nerva's reign. He desperately needed to convince the hostile military they were united. The Latin reads, Concordia exercitum, unity of the army. But in reality, this was pure wishful thinking. Tax cuts and child welfare programs win over senators, but they offer no physical protection when heavily armed men decide they want revenge against the officials who murdered their favorite commander. In October of 97 CE, the tension snapped. The Praetorian Guard, tasked with protecting the emperor, marched on the Palatine Hill and laid siege to the imperial palace. Under the command of Casperius Aelianus, troops breached the marble corridors, hunting for the men who had assassinated Domitian. Nerva stepped out to face them. In a rare display of physical courage, the elderly emperor bared his own throat, demanding the guards strike him down instead of taking his advisors. The soldiers simply pushed past him. They dragged out the conspirators and carried out summary executions. The former chamberlain Parthenius was mutilated before his throat was finally slit. But the guards didn't stop at murder. They dragged Nerva before the citizens of Rome and forced the traumatized emperor to deliver a public speech, thanking the mutineers for their so-called justice. Nerva survived the day, but his political power was gone. The military viewed him with contempt, and the public saw a figurehead signing orders at sword point. Nerva knew his position was destroyed. Provincial governors were already eyeing the throne, and without a successor who commanded the loyalty of the legions, civil war was inevitable. Nerva responded with a maneuver to find a successor who could hold the state together. He climbed the Capitol steps and publicly announced the formal adoption of Marcus Ulpius Trajanus as his son and co-emperor. Trajan was a popular general and the governor of Upper Germany. He held direct command over Rome's strongest and most battle-hardened military force. Aligning himself with Trajan, Nerva instantly neutralized the Praetorian Guard. No mutineer in Rome would dare cross the man commanding the German legions. Nerva surrendered his autonomy to secure the survival of the state. Just months after securing the succession, Nerva suffered a stroke and died in his villa. His ashes were laid to rest inside the mausoleum of Augustus, concluding a reign that lasted barely 16 months. He left behind a structural change that stabilized Rome for a century. By adopting an outsider based entirely on ability rather than bloodline, Nerva established the adoptive principle. He was placed on the throne because he was weak, but his final political move required immense strength of character. By recognizing his own limits and stepping aside for a superior leader, this frail placeholder provided the stability that allowed a golden age to follow.
Rome, 97 CE. The Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit sworn to protect the emperor, has mutinied. They are holding the palace hostage, demanding blood. Inside, Emperor Nerva is trapped. He is elderly, visibly frail, and has no natural heirs. To appease the guards, he is forced to execute the very men who put him in power by assassinating his predecessor. Nerva needs military backing to survive the week, so he makes a calculated gamble. He formally adopts Marcus Ulpius Traianus, a highly popular general commanding the legions on the German frontier, as his son and heir. Traianus did not step into an orderly, peaceful inheritance. He was drafted into the highest office as a tactical emergency measure to stop the Roman Empire from collapsing into an all-out civil war. When Nerva dies of natural causes in January 98 CE, Traianus officially becomes emperor, but he stays put. Instead of rushing back to Rome to claim the throne, he remains thousands of miles away on the Rhine frontier. He uses this distance to clean house. Trajan summons Casparius Aelianus, the Praetorian prefect who led the mutiny against Nerva, to Germany. Far from his political power base in the capital, Aelianus is quietly executed. By the time Trajan finally enters Rome in 99 CE, the immediate threats are gone. He chooses to walk into the city on foot, mingling directly with the crowds and senators as an equal, masking his absolute authority behind a display of deep civic modesty. Without marching a single legion into the capital, Trajan secured the volatile political center of the empire. He proved he could dominate Rome entirely through psychological control and strategic patience. With the home front secure, Trajan turns his attention to a looming existential threat on the Danube border, the wealthy, aggressive kingdom of Dacia, ruled by King Decebalus. To crush Dacia, Trajan mobilizes roughly 150,000 soldiers. He pulls in legions and auxiliaries from across the territories, committing roughly half of the entire Roman army to a single front. Moving a force this massive across a major river requires severe infrastructure. This map shows legions converging on the Danube, necessitating a permanent crossing. A cross-section reveals 1,135 meters of timber arches, supported by 20 masonry pillars, all driven directly into the fast-moving waters. Trajan viewed monumental engineering and logistics as his primary weapons of war. By building permanent infrastructure, he systematically dismantled the natural geography that protected Rome's enemies. The campaign climaxes at the Dacian capital, Sarmizegetusa. Roman forces lay siege to the mountain fortress, locate the city's water pipes, and destroy them. Starved and surrounded, King Decebalus takes his own life rather than surrender. The real prize is underground. Following the interrogation of a captive nobleman, Roman troops discover a staggering fortune that Decebalus had buried beneath the diverted bed of the Sargetia River. Modern estimates suggest the Romans extracted around 165 tons of pure gold and 330 tons of silver from Dacia. This immense wealth flowed directly into the imperial treasury, bypassing the need to heavily tax citizens. Trajan converts this capital into public spectacle. He throws a 123-day festival featuring 10,000 gladiators, and he reconstructs the heart of Rome, importing vibrant foreign marble to build a massive new forum, libraries, and basilicas. The centerpiece of this new complex is Trajan's Column. Wrapping around its 30-meter shaft is a continuous spiral bas-relief, carving the absolute destruction of Dacia into a permanent, towering storyboard. The conquest of Dacia served a dual purpose. It neutralized Rome's most dangerous neighbor, and it provided the blood and gold required to turn the imperial capital into a blinding display of military invincibility. In his final years, Trajan pushes eastward against the Parthian Empire, marching his legions deep into Mesopotamia, annexing new provinces, and becoming the only Roman emperor to advance his army all the way to the shores of the Persian Gulf. Stretching supply lines across the desert proves disastrous. As this map shows, when Roman borders hit the Persian Gulf, violent revolts ignite behind the front lines. Hostile geography forces a rapid retreat, borders contracting violently westward to save the army. The retreat is compounded by natural disasters. Emperor Trajan barely survives a catastrophic earthquake while wintering in the city of Antioch, and shortly after, his health rapidly declines, culminating in a paralyzing stroke. Trajan spent his life testing the limits of Roman power, but the East finally found them. His unyielding drive for expansion pushed the empire past its logistical, geographic, and physical breaking points. In August 117 CE, the ailing emperor dies in the coastal city of Selinus. Because Trajan had never officially named a successor, his death leaves the entire Roman state dangerously exposed to a power vacuum. His wife, Empress Plotina, immediately steps into the void, concealing the news of Trajan's death. She keeps the true state of the emperor hidden within the heavy shadows of his sick room. During this blackout, a document is miraculously produced. It claims that on his deathbed, Trajan officially adopted his trusted general Hadrian as his son and heir. Rumors quickly spread that Plotina forged the signature herself. Trajan expanded the Roman Empire to its absolute maximum territorial extent, yet the continuity of this military superpower ultimately relied on a desperate, fabricated piece of paper.
Rome entered the 2nd century as a machine of endless, bloody conquest. Its next leader was an orphaned intellectual youth who preferred poetry over combat, a boy the elite mockingly called the Greekling. By 117 CE, Roman legions had pushed the empire's borders further than ever before, but these frontiers were dangerously overextended in the east. As Trajan's health failed during his Mesopotamian campaign, he had yet to designate a successor. Trajan died suddenly, followed immediately by an announcement that he had adopted Hadrian on his deathbed. Rumors quickly spread that Empress Plotina had orchestrated the adoption herself, forging the documents while the emperor lay dead. This secretive, dubious transition created immediate instability. Hadrian held the title of emperor, but he lacked the military prestige and clear legitimacy required to secure the throne. The Roman Senate viewed this scholar from the provinces with deep suspicion. They questioned his military record and the suspicious circumstances of his sudden rise to power. Hadrian secured his position through a swift, clinical purge. Before reaching Rome, 4 prominent senators were hunted down and executed without a trial. The bearded, sophisticated philosopher seen in these marble busts was the public image Hadrian cultivated. Behind it lay a man who had just decapitated the senatorial opposition. He deflected the blame for the murders onto his commanding prefect, and simultaneously canceled massive amounts of private debt owed to the state to pacify the remaining elite. Rome's elite quickly discovered that their new philosopher-emperor possessed a terrifying pragmatic capacity for violence. Hadrian immediately halted Rome's expansion, ordering the legions to abandon Trajan's most precarious eastern conquests. He was finished with the policy of endless growth. He shifted the empire's focus to defensive consolidation. In Britain, he commissioned this massive 73-mile stone barrier to physically separate the Roman world from the northern tribes. He spent more than half his 21-year reign traveling, inspecting every province and military camp in person. He was a traveling emperor who ruled from the frontiers rather than the palace. Hadrian prioritized internal discipline and strict boundary control. He exchanged the glory of new conquests for the long-term security of an imperial fortress. The wealth saved from halting offensive wars funded a massive building program. In Rome, Hadrian rebuilt the Pantheon, creating an unreinforced concrete dome that remains a feat of engineering today. He used architecture to mirror the scale of the empire. At his imperial retreat in Tivoli, he blended Egyptian, Greek, and Roman styles, creating a private world that gathered the cultures of his travels into one landscape. His domestic life remained a hollow, childless political arrangement. His marriage to Empress Vithia Sabina lasted nearly 40 years without apparent affection. Hadrian's true emotional focus was Antinous, a young Greek companion who traveled by the emperor's side as his close lover and confidant. In 130 CE, Antinous mysteriously drowned in the Nile. The loss shattered the emperor, who broke all Roman protocol to weep openly before his court. Hadrian used his power to defy the youth's mortality. He declared Antinous a god, built a city in his honor, and established a religious cult that spread rapidly across the Eastern Empire. Hadrian's devotion to Greek culture had a darker application. He sought to unify the empire through forced Greco-Roman assimilation, leaving no room for resistance. In Judea, he banned circumcision and ordered a temple to Jupiter built over the ruins of the Jewish Holy Temple. This aggressive cultural erasure triggered the massive Bar Kokhba rebellion. The patron of the arts responded with a scorched earth campaign. Hadrian took personal command, coordinating a multi-year war to annihilate the resistance. Roman legions slaughtered an estimated 580,000 people and razed nearly 1,000 villages. To erase the region's history, Hadrian renamed the province Syria Palestina. The Builder Emperor annihilated an entire civilization because it refused to fit within his rigid vision of a unified Roman world. Hadrian spent his final years suffering from a painful illness at his villa in Baiae. As his health failed, he became increasingly paranoid, desperate to protect his dynastic line. He ordered a final act of domestic bloodshed, executing his 90-year-old brother-in-law to eliminate any possible challenge to his heirs. He engineered a multi-generational succession plan, adopting Antoninus Pius on the condition that he, in turn, adopt the young Marcus Aurelius. Upon his death in 138 CE, Hadrian was interred in the massive cylindrical mausoleum he designed for himself on the banks of the Tiber. The stability, architecture, and laws Hadrian left behind anchored the empire for a century. He secured every one of them through the same clinical violence that marked his first days in power. In the year 138, the Roman Empire was at a breaking point. The emperor, Hadrian, was dying. As his health failed, his paranoia spiked, and he began ordering the executions of his own senators. Antoninus was the opposite of the current chaos. He was a 51-year-old aristocrat known for his frugality and a steady, predictable temperament. Most importantly, he had no interest in holding supreme power. But Hadrian needed a stable successor. He forced Antoninus to become his heir, but he attached a specific generational condition to the offer. Antoninus had to immediately adopt 2 young boys, ensuring they would eventually inherit the throne after him. Those boys were Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. When Antoninus accepted the arrangement, he told his wife they had lost the privacy they once enjoyed. He took on the burden of the emperorship as an act of self-sacrifice to keep Rome from fracturing. The standoff began the moment Hadrian died. An angry Senate refused to grant the deceased emperor the customary divine honors, seeking revenge for his final years of paranoia. Antoninus responded with a calculated maneuver. He refused to officially accept the throne unless the Senate honored his adoptive father. At the same time, he went to the prisons and pardoned every senator Hadrian had condemned to death. The Romans highly valued pietas, a strict sense of duty to family and the state. By honoring his predecessor while sparing the lives of his political rivals, Antoninus earned a new title, Pius. By resolving the standoff without violence, Antoninus secured a peaceful transition of power between regimes. Behind the public stoicism was a remarkably devoted private life. Antoninus had a rare, happy imperial marriage to Annia Galeria Faustina the Elder, but their life together was marked by loss. Before Antoninus took the throne, the couple endured the deaths of 3 of their 4 children. Then, in 1401 CE, just 3 years into his reign, Faustina died. Antoninus was devastated by the loss. He honored her memory on a massive scale. He convinced the Senate to deify her, minted extensive coinage bearing her face, built a temple in her name, and lived the rest of his life as a widower. His most enduring tribute was the Puellae Faustinianae, or the Girls of Faustina. He established a charitable endowment to educate and protect destitute, orphaned girls in her memory. Antoninus channeled his personal grief into systemic philanthropy. He showed that the wealth of the Roman state could be deployed to care for its most vulnerable citizens. A sense of humane fairness drove his approach to ruling. He governed as a protective parent, moving away from the persona of an autocratic god. He pushed through changes to the legal system regarding slaves. He outlawed the practice of masters killing or torturing their slaves without a trial, and decreed that slaves subjected to extreme cruelty could force their sale to a new master. He also codified a legal principle that forms the backbone of modern justice, the mandate that any accused person must be presumed innocent until they are proven guilty. This shifted the focus of Roman law, which now acted as a shield for the vulnerable rather than a tool for punishment. Unlike the conquerors who preceded him, Antoninus never marched at the head of a legion. He governed the known world from his villas in Italy. His major military action was the invasion of Scotland and the construction of the Antonine Wall. It was a calculated maneuver to secure his military credentials without risking global stability. He spent those quiet decades mentoring his adopted son, Marcus Aurelius. He taught the young heir the value of stoic restraint and the heavy, unglamorous burden of public service. This chart illustrates the financial result of that meticulous management. By avoiding costly wars, he left Rome with a surplus of 2.7 billion sesterces, the largest in the history of the empire. His administrative approach proved that the strength of an empire lies in the health of its treasury and its institutions, not just the expansion of its borders. In 161 CE, at his country estate in Lorium, the 74-year-old emperor fell ill after eating a portion of Alpine cheese. Sensing the end, there was no panic. He called Marcus Aurelius to his bedside and handed over control of the state. As night fell, the captain of the imperial guard approached to ask the emperor for the final watchword. Antoninus replied with a single word: equanimitas, equanimity. He passed away quietly. The Senate deified him, commissioning a monument that depicted him and his wife being carried together into the heavens. Antoninus Pius demonstrated that the strength of an empire could be maintained through quiet duty and justice, led by a calm mind. Lucius Verus reportedly spent his mornings sifting real gold dust into his thick blonde curls, so his hair would catch the light and appear even yellower. His spending was equally flashy. He once held a single banquet for 12 guests that cost 6 million sesterces, sending every man home with silver carriages, muleteers, and jeweled cups. When he wasn't hosting, he was at the races, doting on his favorite horse, Velucer, a stallion he fed with raisins and nuts and draped in blankets dyed with royal purple. This was a man obsessed with his image. But despite the vanity, he wasn't just a socialite. He was Lucius Verus, co-emperor of the Roman world. His reputation as a frivolous playboy has lasted nearly 2 millennia, a legacy that consistently obscures the 4 years he spent successfully managing Rome's most dangerous eastern border. His partner in power was his adoptive brother, Marcus Aurelius, a frail, serious stoic who preferred the company of philosophers to the roar of the circus. This joint rule was a first for Rome, and Marcus often struggled with his brother's chaotic habits, at one point reportedly groaning and weeping over the cost of Lucius's dinner parties. In 161 AD, the Parthian Empire invaded Armenia and crushed a Roman legion, threatening to seize the Roman East. Marcus chose to stay in Rome to handle laws, sending Lucius to Antioch to serve as the military response. Why would a philosopher who championed restraint and duty entrust the survival of the legions to a man known for his love of gold dust and chariot horses? The primary source for this period, the Historia Augusta, claims Lucius spent the entire war dicing through the night and ignoring the mounting casualties on the frontier. It details a scandalous affair with a woman named Panthea, for whom Lucius allegedly shaved off his beard, an act that made him a target of mockery for the local Syrians. To counter these reports, Marcus hurried his teenage daughter Lucilla to Ephesus to marry Lucius mid-war, hoping the union would stabilize the emperor's behavior. However, modern analysis shows the Historia Augusta was written long after Lucius died by an author who heavily exaggerated scandals to create a moral contrast with Marcus Aurelius. Letters from the contemporary scholar Fronto tell a different story, an emperor who spent his days personally inspecting the sickbay and leading the army on foot to discipline a Syrian force that had grown soft from years of peace. Lucius proved to be a masterful delegator. He reformed the rank and file while empowering brilliant generals like Avidius Cassius to execute the complex maneuvers required to win. Once the legions were disciplined, Lucius launched the counteroffensive, driving the Parthians out of Roman territory and pushing the fight toward the enemy capital. The campaign ended in the total sacking of Seleucia and Ctesiphon, where Roman troops burned the royal palace, effectively breaking the Parthian offensive. During the march, Roman soldiers reportedly discovered what they called giant bones in a dried riverbed, a discovery that boosted the army's belief that they were part of a legendary conquest. Lucius returned to Rome in 166 AD, having successfully secured the East, sharing a joint triumph with Marcus, and adding the title Parthicus. The victory was absolute. In 5 years, the co-emperor transformed a demoralized, retreating army into a force that burned the enemy's most prestigious cities. The celebration was cut short. As the legions returned from the east, they carried the Antonine plague, likely smallpox, spreading it through every province they crossed. The disease killed millions, roughly 10% of the empire, decimating the workforce and tax base that kept Rome functioning. Seeing the Roman border defenses weakened by disease, Germanic tribes surged south across the Danube, forcing both emperors back to the front lines. Traveling toward the northern front in 169 AD, Lucius suffered a sudden stroke inside his carriage. He was taken to the town of Altinum, where he died at age 38. His death left Marcus Aurelius to face the crumbling northern border alone, marking the end of the relative peace and shared stability that had defined their joint reign. The suddenness of his collapse sparked immediate rumors of poison, with some accusing his wife Lucilla and others pointing the finger at his co-emperor, Marcus. Historians today dismiss these as products of an era defined by paranoia and pandemic. Lucius likely died of natural causes, or the very plague his own soldiers brought home. He was deified by the Senate and laid to rest in the mausoleum of Hadrian, joining the emperors who built the world he died defending. In his personal writings, Marcus Aurelius thanked the gods for a brother who roused me to vigilance over myself and pleased him with respect and affection. Lucius Verus was a man of his time, extravagant, vain, and fond of the circus, but his ability to reform a failing army and secure the frontier proved he was an essential half of the team that held Rome together. At the height of the 2nd century, the Roman Empire reached its demographic and territorial peak. This was the Pax Romana, a period where Roman wealth and military dominance spanned from the borders of Britain to the banks of the Tigris. The weight of this entire machine sat on the shoulders of Marcus Aurelius. He was a man who held absolute authority over millions, yet his personal letters describe a deep internal resistance to the opulent lifestyle of the imperial court. He didn't seek this power. He was a product of the 5 good emperors adoption system, which forcibly drafted him from a life of quiet philosophical study into the highest office in the world. It created a strange irony. The most powerful man on earth was also its most reluctant ruler. The long peace of the empire shattered when the Parthian Empire invaded Armenia, a vital Roman client state. Marcus responded with a massive counteroffensive. His legions pushed deep into Mesopotamia, culminating in the fiery sack of the twin Parthian capitals, Seleucia and Ctesiphon. The victory was absolute, but the cost was hidden. As the legions marched home to celebrate their triumph, they carried a lethal, unknown disease back across the imperial borders. The very triumph that secured Rome's eastern border served as the catalyst for its greatest biological disaster. This map visualizes the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, spreading along Roman trade routes and killing up to 10 million people. The demographic toll was staggering. With deaths outpacing births, the labor force evaporated, farms were abandoned, and tax revenue plummeted. To keep the state functioning, Marcus stripped the imperial treasury and took the unprecedented step of conscripting gladiators and enslaved people to fill the empty military ranks. While he managed the logistics of a fracturing state, he also dealt with an intimate catastrophe. Smallpox eventually claimed the lives of nearly all of his 13 children. He survived this period of extreme loss by writing to himself in a military tent. These private notes were an exercise in stoicism, a way to process his grief through a lens of duty and reason. The pressures of high mortality and systemic instability forced Marcus to adopt a cold, calculating pragmatism, just to ensure the Roman state continued to function. Seeing the empire weakened by disease, Germanic and Sarmatian tribes seized the opportunity to breach the Danube River. Marcus directed these defensive wars from his headquarters at Carnuntum. He spent his remaining years on this frozen frontier, fighting a grueling war of attrition. During a campaign against the Quadi in 173 CE, his surrounded 12th Legion was saved from dying of thirst by a sudden, violent thunderstorm. The event was so inexplicable, it was co-opted as proof of divine intervention by everyone from Egyptian magicians to early Christians. Despite these tactical victories and perceived miracles, the Roman military was now permanently stuck defending. In 175 CE, his top general in the east, Avidius Cassius, believed a false rumor that Marcus had died and immediately declared himself emperor. Instead of seeking vengeance, Marcus used his journal to remind himself of the importance of forgiveness and the destructive nature of anger. The crisis ended abruptly. Before Marcus even arrived in the east, Cassius was assassinated by his men. By maintaining his inner citadel of reason, Marcus avoided a civil war that likely would have finished the already weakened empire. For decades, the good emperors had survived by choosing a successor based on merit and capability rather than blood. Marcus was the first emperor in generations to have a surviving biological son, Commodus. Commodus was already developing a reputation for being arrogant and easily manipulated, traits that made him entirely unfit to rule a state in crisis. But the calculus was brutal. If Marcus bypassed his own son, he would almost certainly trigger a civil war among his generals. In an act of grim pragmatism, Marcus sacrificed the future stability of Rome to prevent its immediate destruction. He named his son his heir. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, leaving the empire to Commodus. In the decades that followed, the stability of the Pax Romana dissolved. Contemporaries like Cassius Dio marked this as the moment the empire turned from gold to iron and rust. The physical empire would continue its slow decline, but these private Greek manuscript pages survived against all odds. Meditations was never intended for an audience. It survived because it served as a practical study in human resilience. Marcus Aurelius could not stop the physical erosion of his empire, but his private notes survived, serving as an enduring study in how to maintain reason and duty when the world is out of your control. On March 17, 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-king who guided Rome through decades of plague and warfare, died near Vienna. With his death, a 2-century streak of stability known as the Pax Romana came to a sudden halt. For nearly 100 years, Roman emperors had chosen their successors based on merit, adopting highly capable generals to take the throne. Commodus broke that streak. He was the first in a century to inherit the empire simply because he was the boss's son. Marcus Aurelius had tried to prepare him, surrounding the boy with the greatest Stoic minds and rhetoricians of the era. But the Roman historians noted that the young heir was entirely uninterested in philosophy. Instead, he showed a distinct inclination toward lewdness and cruelty from a very early age. According to the historical text Historia Augusta, When Commodus was just 12 years old, he ordered a bathkeeper thrown into a blazing furnace simply because his bathwater had been drawn too cool. A slave burned a sheepskin to produce the stench of burning flesh, just to pacify the boy's rage. The empire required a seasoned, stoic leader to manage its overextended frontiers. Instead, absolute power was handed to an untested teenager who viewed the world entirely through the lens of his own immediate desires. His very first act as sole emperor was to abandon the grueling, multi-year campaign his father had waged against the Germanic tribes along the Danube. Commodus hastily signed a peace treaty, packed up the imperial court, and returned to the lavish comforts of Rome. This retreat alienated the seasoned generals and traditional elites. Tensions festered for 2 years, until 182 AD, when a group of senators, orchestrated by Commodus's own sister, Lucilla, decided the young emperor had to be removed. As Commodus entered a dark passageway, a cloaked assassin stepped out from the shadows and lunged at the emperor with a drawn dagger, but the assassin made a fatal error. Before driving the blade home, he shouted, "See, this is what the Senate has sent you." That brief pause gave the bodyguards enough time to tackle the man to the ground. The plot had failed, but the damage was irreversible. His sister tried to murder him. Trusting the Senate was impossible. Commodus withdrew physically from the capital, spending most of his time isolated in sprawling country estates at Lanuvium, surrounded by a massive personal harem of hundreds of women. To run the empire in his absence, he systematically bypassed the Senate. He handed control of the state apparatus to a succession of trusted chamberlains and freedmen, men who held no noble titles and owed their power entirely to his favor. The most notorious of these was Cleander, a Phrygian former slave who took control of the Praetorian Guard. As this diagram illustrates, under Cleander, the Roman government became a highly lucrative market. He actively sold off patrician statuses, provincial governorships, and even seats in the Senate to the highest bidder to enrich himself and the imperial treasury. By 190 AD, this deep corruption caught up with them. A severe grain shortage, likely engineered by Cleander's political rivals, caused widespread starvation in the capital. The desperate Roman mob rioted and marched directly on the emperor's estate outside the city. Terrified by the thousands of starving citizens surrounding his walls, Commodus saved his own life the only way he could. He threw his favorite puppet to the wolves, executing Cleander and tossing his severed head to the mob. After his family betrayed him and his hand-picked loyalists failed him, Commodus concluded that human alliances offered no reliable protection. Having lost faith in his family and his ministers, he turned to a power he felt was beyond the reach of an assassin's blade: divinity. If mortals were flawed and treacherous, his new defense would be to transcend humanity entirely. Commodus began presenting himself as the literal, living reincarnation of the demigod Hercules. He commissioned statues depicting himself wearing the skin of the Nemean lion and wielding a massive club, demanding that the public worship him as a divine figure. He went so far as to overwrite the physical reality of the empire. He formally renamed the city of Rome to Colonia Commodiana, Commodus's colony. He even changed the names of all 12 months of the calendar to match his own 12 imperial titles. This was the psychological shield of a terrified autocrat who believed that if he could not be loved, he had to be feared as something beyond man. To project a terrifying image of physical invincibility, Commodus took his god complex into the arena. He became the only Roman emperor in history to publicly fight in the Colosseum, stepping onto the sand as a heavily armored gladiator known as a secutor. The displays were grotesquely rigged. He fought compliant opponents who intentionally yielded to avoid execution. He clubbed disabled citizens who had been tied together to resemble mythical giants, and slaughtered thousands of captive exotic animals, reportedly killing over 100 bears in a single day with arrows from a safe balcony. The historian Cassius Dio, who was forced to watch from the stands, recorded a deeply disturbing incident. After decapitating an ostrich in the arena, Commodus walked over to the senatorial section. Holding the bloody head in one hand and his sword in the other, he silently grinned at the terrified senators, who had to chew on their laurel wreaths just to hide their nervous laughter. Legislative governance and statecraft had been entirely replaced by performative terror. The emperor had turned the highest office in the world into a lethal, narcissistic circus. The breaking point arrived on New Year's Eve, 1902 AD. Commodus announced his plan to inaugurate the upcoming year not in the traditional purple robes of state, but by marching out of the gladiator barracks in full arena armor. His inner circle begged him not to disgrace the office so thoroughly. In a fit of rage, Commodus drafted a prescription list of those marked for execution the next morning. But a young boy playing in the palace found the tablet and handed it to Marcia, Commodus's favorite concubine. At the very top of the death list, she read her own name. Knowing they had mere hours to live, Marcia rushed to the chamberlain, Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect, Latus. Together they hatched a desperate, preemptive plot to murder the living god. Marcia slipped poison into the emperor's wine, but Commodus, a heavy drinker, vomited it up and staggered into his private bath to recover. Before he could raise the alarm, the conspirators sent in Narcissus, the emperor's personal wrestling trainer, who overpowered Commodus and strangled him in the water. The moment his death was confirmed, the Senate joyfully passed a decree of damnatio memoriae. They physically erased his name from public records, toppled his Hercules statues, and declared him a public enemy. But removing Commodus did not fix the empire. Without a clear successor, the military structure collapsed into civil war. Rome was instantly plunged into the chaotic Year of the Five Emperors, where the throne was literally auctioned off to the highest bidder by the Praetorian Guard. The paranoia cascade ended the Antonine Dynasty and dismantled the institutional trust his father had spent decades building. This shift signaled the transition into what historian Cassius Dio called an empire of rust and iron, a future defined by military coups and the slow decay of the state.